Okay, I'm not quite sure how to follow that, to be honest. But, the only way I can think to follow it is to say it now for something completely different. I was talking to a friend about what I was doing this evening, and I said what I'm interested in is sexuality and sexual deviation in relation to the Victorian freak show. And he said, oh, well, that's just all about Schadenfreude. People having, as Johnny Rotten once put it, a cheap holiday in somebody else's misery. And it's all about people staring at the less well off. And I said, well, if that's all it is, then that's it. That's the end of my paper. I can go and sit down again. But I think it's a bit more complex than that. So I apologise for reading from the paper, but it's the only way I can keep to the time. Otherwise, I tend to go off on lots of kind of side issues. So apologise for the reading. What I want to start off by saying is that I think the freak or the monster is not just some kind of universal phenomenon that's always been with us in exactly the same way. So the Victorian freak, for me, is a very specific kind of phenomenon. I think what qualifies as a freak changes over history, and it changes culturally. I think of myself as a freak because I'm gender variant. I'm neither kind of male nor female. I have tits and a penis, and that, to a lot of people, makes me incredibly freakish. And God knows what the Victorians would have done with me. But, while I was doing some reading, I found that the etymology of the word monster lies in the word monstrare, and apparently that means to show forth. And what I want to do over the next few minutes is just to explore what shows forth in the spectacular displays of certain monsters or freaks in Victorian freak shows. And it would seem that during the early period of the Enlightenment, around about the middle of the 18th century, we seem to have lost the ability to marvel and wonder at the marvels and wonders of nature. And it's as if the shift from the kind of religious and the theological to the secular produced a kind of disenchantment. And along with this disenchantment came fear. And this seems very odd because the whole purpose of the Enlightenment was to actually get rid of fear and superstition and replace it with reason and rationality. And they don't seem to have been very successful, certainly in relation to freak shows. So what I want to try and argue this evening is that some of the freaks in the Victorian freak show, and particularly those that represented deviations from sexed or gendered norms, were constituted as freaks through a juxtaposition of particular modes of thinking. And I'm thinking of areas like teratology, which was the study of monsters, through medicine, through psychiatry, and through evolutionary theory. And I want to ask a number of questions. Why is it that what some authors call hair out of place, and by that I mean women with beards, with moustaches, women with hairy armpits, freaks with hairy bodies, why do they generate such interest and also concern? What functions do freak shows perform? And are they just places of spectacle and the opportunity to just gaze at the misery of others, or the apparent misery of others? And how do we account for the normative anxieties invoked by the spectacle of these freaks or monsters? And how so many of us appear to have become vulnerable to these anxieties? In her book, Embodying the Monster, Margaret Shildrick says this: so long as the monstrous remains the absolute other in its corporeal difference, it poses few problems. However, once the monster begins to resemble those of us who lay claim to the primary term of identity, or to reflect back aspects of ourself that may be repressed, then its indeterminate status, neither wholly self nor wholly other, becomes deeply disturbing. And what I think she means by that is that provided the monster looks so weird and so strange that it can be completely dismissed as not me, not like me, then it remains outside of our corporeal boundaries. But the minute that it begins to resemble me, even slightly, it's no longer outside. And our own tenuous sense of self begins to feel vulnerable and open to challenge and destabilization. And Shildrick goes on to say this: at the very least, the monster destabilizes the grand narratives of biology and the evolutionary sciences and signifies other ways of being in the world. What does she mean by this? Well, I think she means that freaks and monsters constantly frustrate and elude any and all attempts to categorize them, to the extent that in the end, the Victorians themselves limited the discursive field of teratology to the point where this field focused almost exclusively on so-called biological defects, and that became the point of questioning and arguing about monsters. And this seemed to be in order to try and contain these monsters in this area of teratology. Now, according to historians like Foucault, and don't worry, I won't rabbit on about Foucault all evening, just a quick mention. Foucault argued that there was an explosion of particular kinds of discursive practices during the Victorian period, whose primary aim was the management of bodies, particularly those bodies that were deemed to be deviant. In this view, many of the new human sciences, such as psychology, psychiatry, were not so much sciences of the mind or of human societies, so much as the sciences of the management of particular populations. So in the pursuit of these sciences, the minutiae of human bodies were examined, measured, categorized, and normalized. And one popular target of these normalizing systems was differently gendered bodies. Different because the size, the shape, the genitalia, the facial features, the hairiness, the musculature, and so on, failed to pass these imaginary tests of normalcy. And according to Cindy Lacombe, who's written a number of articles on the issue, particularly of bearded women in the freak shows, she argues that in addition to schools, hospitals, and prisons, the freak show became one venue for the attempted management of potentially transgressive bodies. And the 19th century freak show in particular came to be invested by broader ideological concerns. After all, she points out, human freaks and monsters had been exhibited at least from the 16th century, so what was so particular about the Victorian period? David Gerber, in a book called The History and Laws of Freak Shows, suggests that human exhibits are mirror images of what we fear we might become if our inchoate and deep-seated anxieties about the violations in the integrity of our bodies were somehow realized. So what he's basically saying is we're constantly trying to keep these freaks, these strange people, these deviant bodies at arm's length, at a distance, and imagine them as not me, even though there are clear resemblances between them and me. Shildrick also argues that we can only maintain a very delicate and vulnerable sense of selfhood through what she calls putative exclusions. And by this she means foreigners, racial others, people with congenital disabilities, people who are differently gendered, and so on. And what we began to see in these freak shows is the kind of multiple exhibition of all these different kinds of bodies exhibited together as though they can all be categorized in one way, which is deviant. So she argues that one of these anxieties was how to justify the colonization of non-Western peoples. This anxiety was played out in the context of the new evolutionary theories. So freak shows would display exotic, savage bodies alongside those bodies that might be seen as sexually ambiguous, and they were often referred to as hermaphrodite. Such displays could therefore serve multiple purposes, justifying colonization and the management of sexuality, while simultaneously reinforcing the idea that all of these bodies were degenerate, literal examples of arrested development or de-evolution. And what I'm really arguing here is that by exhibiting all of these bodies in a so-called freak show, you could argue that these bodies are examples of atavism or de-evolution. So these bodies are de-evolving, they're primitive, they're less than, basically, they're less than human. But apart from evolutionary concerns, the hirsute woman was an ever more overt receptacle for cultural anxieties about sex, gender roles and categories, and the whole issue of the male-female dyad. In the face of first wave feminism and the calls by people like Havelock Ellis for the legalization and acceptance of homosexuality, it was vitally important to the Victorians, and particularly the patriarchs, I would suggest, to keep the male-female opposition firmly in place. Yes, I was struck. I had to leave this in. It's not exactly relevant. Are there any Australians in tonight? Because, you know, I said earlier on that freakishness is a historical element. Australians were originally all freaks, apparently. In the battles for all kinds of social, political, scientific, legal, and cultural authority throughout this period, the economy of sex-gender, which of course placed white, heterosexual males at its apex, relied absolutely on a clear, distinct, natural difference between men and women. Any bodies that destabilized or disturbed this natural, quote-unquote, opposition had to be characterized as abject and as monstrous. And furthermore, given that the supposedly superior sciences of the Enlightenment had now replaced the superstitions of Christianity, if we couldn't rely on scientists to bring order to the world, what else would we have left to avoid chaos and anarchy? Is it too much of an exaggeration then to suggest that for the Victorians, the hairy woman embodied a moment of existential uncertainty? And this is both why she was so mesmerizing and why she had to be contained within the confines of teratology and these freak shows. The West effectively had a duty to identify, explain, and exhibit, always, of course, for edification and education only, and not for any nefarious means. They then had to either civilize or eradicate these monsters to stop this process of de-evolution or degeneration. There's an excellent book on this subject by Alice Drager. It's called Hermaphrodites. And she argues in this book that the Darwinian idea of atomism or arrested development was thought by many teratological theorists, particularly in 19th century France, to explain a whole host of variations, particularly in relation to sex and gender. And again, these ideas about devolutions were seen as signs of degeneracy. And according to her research, facial hair on women signified in different ways depending on which country you were in. In Britain, it was more likely to be correlated with insanity. In France, it was likely to be a sign, interestingly, of virility, but masculine virility, obviously, because women aren't virile, right? But it might also be indicative of racial, particularly Jewish, age, i.e. postmenopausal, or gendered opposite or same gender characteristics. And again, you can see from this slide how there's this kind of multiple exhibition of these bodies. So you've got the man with what appears to be fur instead of a beard. A very rare poster this is, because most of the time hermaphrodites were not allowed to show their genitalia, so it's quite unusual to see genitalia exhibited in a poster. You've got this alongside somebody who's without arms, and then the kind of the standard showing of the woman with the beard. Now, this multiplicity of signification was extremely unsettling for the Victorians, and in the end, paradoxically, I would argue the freak shows were not a very effective means of managing these supposedly transgressive bodies, because the continual presence of the hairy woman refused to let the Victorians deposit their vulnerabilities and anxieties in a place where they could conveniently forget about them, and of course get some kind of pleasure for taking the "thank God it's not me" position. According to Margaret Childrick, she concludes that the real problematic is not the freak or the monster, but the emergence of a sense of vulnerability on the part of the audience in the presence of these so-called freaks. And in this sense, she argues, it's perhaps the audience that should be the real spectacle, or maybe, if you like, the real monsters. And when I read that piece, I'm a bit of a Bowie fan, I thought I'd end with a couple of lines from Width of a Circle, just to show my age. And he says this: "And I ran across a monster who was sleeping by a tree, and I looked and I frowned."